Christ is among us. Good to see you all today. Just in the wake of the Sunday of Orthodoxy, where we celebrated and affirmed the reality of not simply icons, but the idea of God being present in and through creation. We used to hear a lot about icons and learn about them, the meanings, the symbolisms, and so forth, the stylized approach of things. But in the wake of all that, always in Orthodox thought is that people are the ultimate icon. We are made in the image of God, ikona theou. And the word icon in the ancient world, it was used more like to be a mirror, a mirror. You hear the oft repeated image of icons being like a window to heaven. But the reality of the word was used more like to mirror or reflect something. And reflection, if you want to get the sunlight to reflect off of a mirror, you have to have it to point it in the direction of the light. If you don't have the mirror pointed in that direction, it will not reflect that reality. In fact, it'll wind up being darkness. And a lot of this is as we look at Lent, is reclaiming also the fuller picture of what Lent means, to mirror the fuller picture of Lent. And that is in the sense that in the early centuries, Lent was not only a preparation and looking forward to the time of celebrating the death and resurrection of Christ, and a general preparation through prayer, fasting, reflection, and so forth. But into the late third century, and definitely into the fourth, it became also structured to be the last, if you will, kickoff of preparation for the catechumens as they were preparing to be integrated into the life of the church at Pascha. And this was a very actually powerful thing, because there was a tradition, and apparently lasted for a few centuries in the first millennia of Christianity, at least in the Eastern churches, was that Pascha might be the time that Jesus actually even appears to finish what he started. Because the understanding is Christ is already here. He's not in another galaxy waiting to, quote, come back. The coming of Jesus is no different than a pregnant woman saying her baby is coming. Well, the baby's right there. The baby's not in Europe and the woman's here. So we see this fact of Christ being present, and are we facing that direction? As we face Christ, though, there's something that Jesus seems to do, is that we can't face him alone without facing everyone else who's with him. Because that's the meaning of church. It's not just about an isolated personal relationship. My children in our family relate to me as the father, my wife as the mom, and so forth. But they can't avoid relating with each other in the process. To be part of all this, to be part of who we are, is to also be part of the family in that way. Well, the Sundays preceding the beginning of actual Lent, there's a set of services called the Triodion. And in the Triodion, these services, there's a stage of the first few weeks before Lent officially starts with Clean Monday. And there's a Sundays and readings that go into that. And I'm going to run through what those gospel images are focused on in each one. First, we start out with the famous story of the tax collector and the Pharisee. Great and powerful image. Tax collector is somebody, especially back then, and imagine this, and our parish is named in honor of the apostle and evangelist Matthew. And I always think about him because he's very marginalized. When you were a tax collector as a Jewish person in that century, you were seen as a traitor because you were a collaborator with the Romans. You not only collected taxes for them, but you also had commission, quote unquote, on the side under the table being paid to you. And so when you hear about a very wealthy tax collector, that means he took a lot of under the table payments. And if you did not pay not only the tax, but if you didn't even pay the gratuity or the commission to the tax collector, your family could be thrown into prison, enslaved, and so on and so forth. So this is why tax collectors are hated. And it's interesting because of the company that Jesus kept was inclusive of people like this. They were unclean because they interacted with Gentiles, but even so more hated because they worked for the Gentiles and even would cooperate or be part of the process of enslavement and subjugation by the Roman Empire. And so the power of the story is really not so much the Pharisee. I mean, it's kind of expected he's to do good things on one level, but the fact, if he were the Jewish audience, to hear that the tax collector was made righteous, he was made right with God. They both are in the temple, they're both praying, and it's a very much a powerful image of the church where we have people of all kinds of backgrounds, including people that would be considered marginalized as part of the church, part of the community. Think of that in terms of the people coming into the life of the church, and that they would be integrated into this. Sunday following is a Sunday of what we call the prodigal son, which really probably more appropriately should be called the parable of the father with his two sons, because both play a role. Real fast, of course, we know the prodigal son wants his share of the inheritance, which in that culture, to ask your parents for their share of what was going to be given in the will was almost like saying, "You're dead to me." And he takes the money and runs off and parties his brains out, basically. And then a famine hits, and we know he's stuck in a pig pen, which, keep in mind the Jewish sensibilities of all this, because pigs are not kosher. And the fact that the pig's food even starts looking good to eat. He's so desperate. And then the gospel, points out that he came to himself. He came to his senses. And he goes back with the intent of, I know my father can't receive me after the way I treated him, and so on and so forth. I can just hope that he'll hire me as one of the servants of the household. So he gets there, and the father, of course, sees him from afar off, runs, greets him, hugs him, repeatedly kissing him. And even though the son protests, I'm not worthy to be called your son, hire me, he doesn't listen. And we know the whole thing, where he's restored back into the household, which is seen not only by putting clothing back on him, but the ring on his finger, which means he resumes his place in the family. Meaning the father shares his name, even as, in a sense, his authority with whoever wears his ring. And that's why rings were kind of like that in regardless of the relationship, whether it be parent to child, spouses, and so on and so forth, sharing of life, authority, everything else. Anyway, so he's brought back in the house. They have a big party, as we know. Older son, who's always, quote unquote, done the right thing and never strayed from, doing whatever his father wanted. He's upset. He hears the party and the commotion going on, and says, as we know, the classic thing that, what's up going on? My brother's back, and this is the big party. So he refuses to go into the house. Just, I want to make one point really strong about this too. Being in the house means being part of the community of God's people. The house is God himself, in a sense, his household and everything else. The younger son, in order to go party and be immoral and crazy and so forth, he removes himself out of the house by living that lifestyle. And then by repenting about that, he comes back and is restored into the house. Now the younger son, who's, quote unquote, always been in the house, finds his brother is back, and he's refusing to accept him and refuses to go into the house. And one of the powerful things about the parable is, after the father pleads with his older son, please come in, and so forth, and he's yelling at his father, this son of yours, he won't even acknowledge it's his brother, because he's like, now what's left of the inheritance that would have just been for me is going to be split between my brother and I, and so I'm not getting as much as I thought I would have, and so on and so forth. So he's angry, and he refuses to go into the house. And Jesus leaves the parable dangling, if you will. We don't know what happened to the little brother. Did he stay outside? So it's really again, an image of, there are people coming into the life of the church, some already in the life of the church, but people now being integrated. Like I said, those who are going to be baptized, integrated into the church of Pascha. And, we're not comfortable with them. Like the Pharisee's not comfortable, fully with the tax collector. The older brother is not comfortable with the son. Okay. And yet who's made right with God? What their life turned around was made right. And so forth. And the pride of the older brother that keeps him outside of the house. And then we come to the Sunday of the Last Judgment. And the Last Judgment in Matthew 25 is very powerful because of the fact it includes people. It's, Lent is not supposed to be, and the Christian life is not supposed to be simply about my personal spirituality and doing the right thing so when I die, I go to the nice place in the sky type of thing. But the idea of being in a partnership with God himself on his project to rebirth creation, humanity, everything else that, of course, would be embodied in the person of Jesus for the Christians. And so what is the parable? It's like, come blessed of my Father, separating the sheep and the goats. I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but, because you were there for me. I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison and you visited me. I was ill and you cared for me, etc. And then we'll say to him, well, when did we ever see you like that? Insofar as you did it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it to me. Then the other group that actually winds up things don't turn out good real fast is the people who say, well, when did we ever see you that way? And because he's saying, you're not part of this because I was hungry and you didn't feed me. I was a stranger, you didn't welcome me. I was thirsty, you didn't give me drink. I was ill and you didn't come care for me, or in prison and visit me. And what you see almost is this image, like you see those reality TV shows about undercover bosses. They pretend they're an employee or maybe even a customer just to see how their employees would be working with each other or how they treat the customers. And I think that's a very powerful thing for us. Is God is there. We may not be aware of it, but he's there in the person of these other persons who come to us. I know one of the challenges we have is we may want to do outreach and work with people who've struggled with issues or been marginalized. But I think one of the big things is that we struggle to have them come and be part of our communities, to be integrated in the church. It's like, we'll help those people as long as they stay out there. And that's not the way the gospel runs. And again, it would have been very real for people going into Lent thinking about all these other people who were marginalized. Keep in mind, the early church was a really mixed bag in terms of people's backgrounds, people who had been criminals, people who had been sex workers, people who had sometimes just blue-collar fishermen, yes, intellectuals, people who were slaves. I mean, imagine, because they would have their services beginning with sunset for the longest time, going into, quote, the first day of the week, sunset Saturday night, became really the beginning of it. And if you were a slave, you finished church and you couldn't go home. You went home, but to be the slave and perform the tasks of the slave in your master's household. So do we integrate? And I think that's the powerful thing of the judgment story is, if Jesus came to any of our churches with his entourage, as I like to call it, and think of it again, think of the people that were hanging around with Jesus. Yes, some people who were very well off, but also some people who have been sex workers, tax collectors, zealots. When you see the word zealot, imagine a Jewish version of ISIS. That, if you ever dishonored God and had followed the Torah the way they thought it should be followed, you could even be killed to maintain, quote, the honor of God, unquote. All these people mixed in. And my question becomes, maybe this is part of the Last Judgment story. If we rejected those people, what makes us think Jesus would stay and be with us? So that's one of the challenging aspects of all this. And then there's the Sunday of forgiveness, which reminds us about our exile from paradise. The fact we turn our back on God. We buy the suggestion we can't trust God, and we got to try to empower ourselves, have a piece of fruit, and empower yourself, forget God, can't trust him, and so forth, which is the struggle everybody has every day, to trust that, is this God who's the supreme reality, even outside of time and space? Does he really love me? And the fact of that love being embodied in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, taking all our DNA, all our human realities organically into himself to heal, to reverse the toxins and everything else that we've obtained through sin, by eating the poison of the knowledge of good and evil, wanting to know good and evil without God. We determine what is good and evil, which is how a lot of the world runs today. And then finally, of course, like I said, we come to Sunday of Orthodoxy, which is the first Sunday of Great Lent, and the Vesper service that traditionally was done Saturday evening, right? And yes, we celebrate the icons. We celebrate the icons, but the challenge to us, are we that icon? Are we that icon of Jesus and who he is and what he's about and all those he's drawing into his embrace? Are we that icon? And it depends on the direction you place the mirror. What are we reflecting to people? What are we reflecting to people? That's our challenge. That's what Lent is. And if we approach Lent, even with the old tradition of possibly at Pascha, notice I said possibly, but at Pascha, Jesus would appear to finish what he started in his death and resurrection. Right while we're singing Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and suddenly this incredible explosion beyond the 3-dimensional, 14-dimensional, whatever existence comes exploding into creation with Jesus and his entourage coming in the clouds of heaven to earth. So understand, where are we facing that mirror? The liturgy is supposed to be an attempt to mirror, to reflect the already existing reality of the reality of God offering himself, Christ offering himself in the liturgy. We step into that one reality again, and we're trying to mirror that. Not as we're fabricating, but we're trying to mirror what is already real in God's eyes, and letting that reality be soaked into us, and we become reflections of that reality. And we can only become reflections of it if we are facing the real Jesus with the real understanding about who he is and the people that he draws to himself. So may we be those icons, that they're not just up on the walls, because icons on the walls can sadly just be like a museum after a while. If it's not an icon, those icons are not icons of the people gathered together, the community that invites the world that God so loved that he sacrificially gives his only begotten Son, that whoever would entrust themselves to him would not be destroyed, but have life in the age to come. So may God bless us. Remember the Lord and remember his goodness to us. Remember that he's put us in a partnership with him to see this reality, this incarnate reality, extended into this broken, hurt, and fearful world, just like he descended into Hades to bring life for all of us. God bless you.